Good morning and welcome to Bloomberg UK. I'm Tom McKenzie in London. Now, the UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and Labour leader Keir Starmer have gone head-to-head in their final TV debate before next week's election. Starmer accused Sunak of being out of touch and attacked the Conservatives' record in government, while Sunak hit back at Starmer on taxes and migration.
And higher welfare. That's what Keir Starmer will do. If you want lower taxes and lower welfare, that's what I will do.
And I just want to address Beverly's point.
You opposed it when I announced it. You literally opposed it.
If you listen to people in the audience across the country more often, you might not be quite so out of touch.
Could we get a better trading deal with Europe?
You know what? You might be able to. But do you know what the price of it will be? It will be free movement of people.
No,
and that's what Keir Starmer's not being straight with you about.
OK, let's bring in Bloomberg's EMEA News Director Ros Matheson and Bloomberg's Adam Blenford. Adam, I want to start with you on what the key takeaways were from this debate. There was a lot riding on this, arguably for the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, given the poll gap. Did the needle move? What stood out to you from this debate?
You're right, Tom. Sunak, the Prime Minister, needed quite a convincing performance to try and overturn what's been a very stubborn and pretty wide poll deficit. You know, the whole 4 or 5 week election campaign, the Conservatives have been trailing about 20 percentage points behind Labour. So with 1 week to go before election day, really Sunak needed to land some kind of knockout blow on Starmer. He came out really quite pugnacious. He was quite punchy. His attack lines were well rehearsed. He looked like he sort of believed what he was saying, but the snap polls at the end suggested that it hadn't really made that kind of breakthrough that he was needed. One put them level pegging at 50-50. That isn't going to move the needle in the same way that he might need. And one a little later on in the evening suggested actually that Starmer won the debate.
And Ros, we are just a week away from this vote. July the 4th, we're all going to be going to the polls, at least British nationals. We'll see what the turnout is actually going to be like and whether or not that's going to be suppressed if people are really engaged in this election. Taxes came up again as an attack line for the Conservatives, for Rishi Sunak. Is that landing at all with the electorate? How potent is that as a tool in the next, 7 days that we have?
Well, as Adam was saying, you saw Sunak really come hard on taxes again in the debate last night, saying to voters, watch out, you're going to surrender your finances, your family finances to Labour, not just on taxes but also on welfare. So basically, can you trust Labour with your finances? And he said that throughout the campaign and again in the debate last night. The question is, which voters is that aimed at? Is that aimed at Labour voters? Is it aimed at the Tory voters who are a bit frustrated after the many years of Tory leadership, particularly the last few years of chaos? And is he trying to peel those voters back to the Tory base? Is he also trying to stop voters leaching to the far right, to Nigel Farage in all of this? So is that message really geared at Labour voters, more about shoring up his own base going into the vote?
How damaging, Adam, do you think the whole Gamblegate scandal has been? This is members of the Conservative Party allegedly placing bets on the timing of the election. To what extent has that been another smear on this campaign?
Well, I certainly saw some research that suggested this was the news story that had cut through the most during the 5 weeks of the campaign, bookended by Rishi Sunak leaving the D-Day commemorations early, which was a few weeks ago and was the precursor to one or two of the other TV debates. So Sunak's been battling these sort of headlines throughout the campaign, and it was noticeable last night, as we said. He came out kind of punching, as Ros was saying there, with some effective lines. A week or so ago, he was almost apologetic. There was a question and answer session, not a head-to-head, but he was almost looking like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. Yesterday it was a slightly different Rishi Sunak, but as Ros was saying, he's trying to appeal to a type of voter, and Keir Starmer, who would be the Prime Minister next week if Labour wins the election, was projecting a really quite different tone and talking about quite different things. OK, and we'll get on to the other parties shortly, but I just want to get to the polling, Ros, with you, because we always have to provide the caveat. Yes, the polls have consistently showed about a 20-point lead for the Labour Party, but they are just polls. The vote will happen, of course, on July the 4th. We were speaking to Anand Menon, a keen watcher, of course, an expert on the UK political scene. He said even if you had the worst polling results, it would still be a significant victory for the Labour Party. But he did also say that there's about by some estimates, 5 million undecided voters still. Is there a concern for Labour that people will sit out this election and maybe the undecideds could turn
to the Conservative Party? Maybe they're not telling the pollsters what they really feel.
Well, there is that question generally about polling, about how much people tell you in the minute in the poll and how much what they actually do when they go to vote on the day. But also, you mentioned turnout, and that's going to be crucial. We can see the messaging coming from Labor is let's not be too complacent. Now, the polling does show they're on course for victory, possibly even a super majority. But, you know, they don't want Labor voters sitting at home and saying, I don't need to go and vote because this is locked in. And equally, Sunak needs the Tory voters to come out and vote for him and not to vote for Nigel Farage at the same time. And so you can see really it's going to be a question about motivating people to come out and vote. And that's really what Labor seems to be concerned about, is this polling shows such a large margin for victory. Does that deter people in the end from bothering on the day?
Adam, for a lot of our viewers based here in the City of London, there will be a competition within their constituencies between the Lib Dems and the Conservatives. The Lib Dems trying to make a play for southern England. Talk to us about the messaging there and what the Lib Dem picture could look like. Absolutely.
This is one of the intricacies, both of the UK electoral system, where it's a winner-takes-all system in any given constituency. You just have to get the most votes and you win the seat. But the Liberal Democrats, of course, were in government with the Conservatives from 2010 to 2015 and then were kind of wiped out electorally as a result. They've gradually rebuilt themselves as a very centrist party, perhaps even more to the centre than the soft-left Labour. And they are challenging the Conservatives in many of those traditionally Conservative strongholds, where it's very difficult for the Conservatives to tread the line between appealing to the Nigel Farages of the world that Ros was talking about, taking a tough line on immigration, while also appealing to what was traditionally known as the One Nation Tories, the shires of middle and rural England, people with small c Conservative values who have traditionally voted for the Conservatives, but were not in. It's not been part of the mainstream conversation for a lot of this campaign. But Brexit, for example, divided the Conservative Party down the middle between those in southern southwest England who didn't necessarily back Brexit and some elsewhere who voted for them who did. OK, so we watch to see how the story evolves for the Lib Dems. The Green Party, and Guy Johnson spoke to the head of the Green Party, and both Labour and the Conservatives have been critiqued, of course, by the IFS around their manifestos and not being transparent. The IFS would say around revenue raise that's needed. And, of course, Labour has said they're not going to be raising some of the main tax pillars or not pulling those levers. The Greens, though, say they would raise taxes. Take a listen.
So we would seek to raise taxes on those with the broadest shoulders to increase the funding on day-to-day spending. And then in terms of the investment that's needed in the transition to a green economy, the capital investment in things like public transport, insulating our homes, renewable energy, we would be willing to do some borrowing for that, because that's about borrowing for investing in the future. And the economic opportunities that come with that are huge for all of us, and actually the costs of not acting on the climate crisis are much bigger than the costs of acting.
So the Green Party co-leader speaking to Guy Johnson there. Ros, I bring you in on this. If the Green Party have a decent election, is there a picture that we could see unfolding where they play a role in pressuring any future Labour government, if indeed that's what we get, into a higher tax regime? What kind of role do you see the Greens playing?
Well, it's interesting because there actually hasn't been a lot of conversation about the Greens really in this election. It's been the Tories, Labour, Lib Dem and also, of course, Nigel Farage. But the Greens are really out on a limb on this one because the Tories have been very clear that they're walking back a lot of their promises around net zero. They're pushing timeframes back and so on. And even Labour is being very careful about that because the messaging really that is resonating with voters is right now they know people are doing it tough. There's a cost of living crisis, they say, in the UK, and people are worried about the very short term. And so if you go to voters and talk about the long term and they need to think about that, right now that's less of a priority. And so the Greens are kind of pushing against that door a bit with their campaigning. However, they are sticking to their guns on it, and they're saying we realise we would need to raise taxes to do it. So interestingly, if Labor does get in, you can see the Greens playing a role, as you say, holding Labor to account a bit on that, because Keir Starmer's been, pushed on the tax issue. No, I'm not going to raise taxes. No, taxes won't go up. The Greens might say that they need to do that to some extent to adhere to some of these net zero, pledges, and that's really a core issue for Labor.
So from the threat to the right then, to the Conservative Party, Adam, and you talked about Nigel Farage, the leader now of Reform UK. Where does Reform stand at this point as we count down to next week?
Reform has successfully managed to attract the attention of the Conservative Party. You know, the Conservatives and Labour are the two heavyweights here, and their conversation has been dragged or centred very much on the idea of lower taxes and not raising taxes, which is why the Greens that you're just talking about there are finding themselves as this sort of lone voice on this. And immigration, you know, Farage and Reform have prioritised the issue of immigration, which has become a touchstone for the Conservatives. All through the last year or so, Sunak has been standing and making speeches with the slogan "Stop the Boats," trying to stop the small boat arrivals across the English Channel and talking up the Rwanda deportation scheme, which hasn't yet really managed to send anybody out of the UK. So Reform is in some way setting the conversation. The Conservatives are in their camp. The question about Reform is, can they turn that into electoral success? Nigel Farage is trying to stand, I think it's for the 8th time as an MP, hasn't managed to be elected before. He's got a good chance. Clacton, where he's standing, has previously elected an MP from the precursor of the Reform Party. So, you know, he's got a chance. It will be very interesting. The Greens and Reform are both penalised by the electoral system, which, if they get 10 to 15% of the vote, won't return them many MPs, and that's the limitation for them.
The post versus
that's the issue for them in terms of pressure. Yeah.
Adam, thank you very much indeed. Bloomberg's Ros Matheson, of course, and Adam Blenford breaking down where we stand in terms of the run-up, of course, to that vote here in the UK on July the 4th. Thank you both for the analysis. We're going to be speaking, by the way, to author and journalist Will Hutton in the next few minutes, getting his view on the election and what he believes it will take to, quote, rebuild Britain. That conversation is next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back. Now, Brexit and economic growth, just some of the contentious issues in the general election, which, of course, is now just 1 week away. For more on this, let's bring in Will Hutton, journalist and the author of This Time, No Mistakes, How to Remake Britain. You can see the book there on your screen. Will, thank you very much for joining us. In the first 100 days of the next administration, whoever's in government, what should the policy priorities be, Will?
Investment. Britain's got a productivity crisis. It's got a growth crisis. It's got a living standards crisis, and we've got to lift levels of investment decisively. And I think in the first 100 days, you will see measures to start that long road back. So for me, there's 3 institutions that Labour will inherit, which can be turbocharged and without raising taxes to kind of try and lift the growth rate. One is the Pension Protection Fund, which could be doubled, trebled in size, and it could provide lines of investment for, crucially, the UK Infrastructure Bank, which could lend very much more than it's currently doing, and the British Business Bank. And, of course, you've got the Catapult network of innovation centres, which are kind of undernourished and underfunded and they need really turbo boosting. You go for those 4 things and you can start to get growth moving, in my judgment. And I think they will go big time for infrastructure. And I think one of the first things you'll see in the first 100 days will be the establishment of this kind of infrastructure commission. So, you know, that's kind of one area I'm looking for. A second area is plainly energy, net zero. I think they will start to bring the legislation forward for Great British Energy and begin thinking about how they're going to kind of decarbonise the grid and decarbonise our economy at a more rapid rate. And they'll have to do something on NHS waiting lists. So, you know, in the first 100 days, I'm looking for action on all those 3 things, culminating in a budget in September in which I think there'll be increased borrowing for public investment. So there you are. That's my kind of start at 10.
Will, on the front of your book, you have a quote from Keir Starmer, potentially our next Prime Minister, saying, "A brilliant book, read it if you haven't already." I put the potential there. We know what the polls are suggesting, but it, of course, is not a done deal until the votes come through. So we're not going to make too many assumptions. But there has been a critique of this Labour Party that they have not been bold enough, whether on issues like pushing through with the wealth tax or getting closer to the EU. But you outline a pretty bold picture there, Will. You have your ear to the ground. You talk to members of the Labour Party. Do you expect more boldness? Is there a concern that they're not going to push through on some of these issues to really get to that growth? 2.5% is what Keir Starmer suggested. That seems pretty fanciful at this stage.
I think they will get 2.5% growth, and I think they will pull levers pretty aggressively to get there. Yeah, Keir Starmer was very enthusiastic about my book at the launch of the book. He has read it, and tells me he wants to take the ideas forward in it. So make that what you will. I think that of course they're constrained. I mean, they've ruled out all these tax increases in the three big taxes. I would expect them to increase capital gains tax, have a major overhaul of capital gains tax. I'd expect them to have an overhaul of inheritance tax, and I would expect them to have a review of the system of residential property taxation in the UK, looking to get kind of more money from all those three areas. But they can do a lot without raising taxes. One of Rishi Sunak's kind of bequests, one of his bequests to,
Well, no, I was going to ask, because those are some of the levers in terms of raising revenue, but you also suggest in your book that you should look at more borrowing, more public borrowing. That surely will collides with market reality. We saw that with Liz Truss.
Well, I think there's two things about that. I mean, the FT carried a story last week showing how asset managers and asset owners would be prepared to kind of buy British debt if it was understood it was to support public investment. And two, as Napoleon said, give me lucky generals. I mean, at the moment, if you look at if you're an international investor, do you want to hold French debt, German debt, Italian debt, Spanish debt, or British debt? And so there comes a we're going to look a bit of a safe haven, I think, as political turmoil breaks over France. So I think. And there is scope. The key is that you've got a tax base to support servicing your debt, and secondly, you're actually spending money on public investment. I mean, infrastructure, R&D, training, leveling up. These are transport links, the port system, which is kind of falling apart. I mean, everyone understands the need for infrastructure investment. And actually, Britain has got quite an interesting institutional framework to do it. The UK Infrastructure Bank, which has only lent £3 billion over the last 3 years, could lend £10 billion a year. And it wouldn't lend on its own behalf. It would guarantee the lending of other people. So it would all be off balance sheet and wouldn't score as public debt.
Well, what is the role of the City of London in this diagnosis around the need for more investment?
Big time. I mean, I think that, the big insurance companies have been dancing around, kind of creating kind of a pooled private sector wealth fund to match the public sector wealth fund. Nothing has happened so far, despite the Mansion House declaration of last July. And Jeremy Hunt wasn't very vigorous Chancellor Jeremy Hunt wasn't very vigorous in pushing this. There's a lot of receptivity for that. If you ask around, you will find that the kind of leaders of the big four insurance companies, some of the big asset management houses are really interested in actually creating pooled private sector investment vehicles to match a public sector wealth fund, and the two would act kind of in a symbiotic relationship, rather as happens actually to a degree in Canada. So you've got that play to stimulate investment, and you are talking run rates there of 10 to 20 billion a year. You've got the UK Infrastructure Bank. You've also got the Pension Protection Fund. The Pension Protection Fund's only got 35 billion in it at the minute. But if you really allowed it to kind of treble in size, so it's £100 billion fund, it's been very smart in the way it's invested. It could support the British Business Bank and the UK Infrastructure Bank even more without raising any taxes. You have got the institutions to support growth.
Apart from maybe capital gains tax. So that was interesting. Will Hutton, really fascinating, the diagnosis of some of the issues facing this UK economy and what may be to expect in her first 100 days, if indeed you get a Labour administration. Journalist and, of course, an author of This Time, No Mistakes, How to Remake Britain. Plenty more coming up. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg. Bloomberg understands that Australian bank and asset manager Macquarie made about $1.2 billion by selling off a 48% stake in Thames Water before 2018. The heavily indebted British water company is currently on the verge of collapse. Bloomberg's Rachel Morrison has the details. Rachel, what do we know?
Well, what's really interesting about this story is we sort of know for the first time that Macquarie investors made a 2.5 times return on their original investment in Thames Water. And really, the people who bought from them now have that investment classified as worthless. So it's a really interesting sort of deep dive into what was happening at the time at Thames Water and a kind of story that tells us how we got to partly where we are today with Thames Water in big trouble.
OK, Rachel Morrison, thank you very much indeed on the update there in terms of Macquarie pushing through with some profit, at least from 2018, in terms of Thames Water, as we continue to watch the plight, of course, of that company. Across the European stock 600, you're currently seeing modest losses of about 0.1%. The mood has changed. US futures, S&P E-minis, also pointing light by 0.2%. Be sure to subscribe to Bloomberg's In the City podcast, by the way, with Francine Lacroix alongside hosts Allegra Stratton, Dave Merritt. This week's episode features the CEO of electronics retailer Currys. Bloomberg Brief is next. This is Bloomberg.